I almost didn't cover this one, not because it wasn't important, but because I had to verify it 3 times before I believed it was real. Just 2 days ago, Trump's chief trade negotiator sat down with journalists and said the quiet part out loud. If Canada wants any kind of trade deal with the United States, it needs to permanently accept tariffs. Not temporarily, not as a transition, permanently. As a fixed, built-in feature of whatever new agreement replaces the trade deal that has governed North American commerce for over 30 years. Read that again if you need to. The man who will be sitting across from Canada's negotiators in the coming weeks just told the world that the era of tariff-free trade between these two countries is over by design. And then Mark Carney responded. And what he did, or rather what he conspicuously chose not to do, tells you everything about the strategy Canada is now running. So let me walk you through exactly what happened, why the timing matters more than anyone's admitting, and what this means for a relationship that moves nearly 4 billion Canadian dollars worth of goods and services every single day. Here's the sequence. On Tuesday night, February 25th, Donald Trump delivered his State of the Union address to Congress. 108 minutes of it. He praised the U.S. men's hockey team that beat Canada at the Winter Olympics. Some of those players were literally in the room. And he told Congress he was committed to tariffs no matter what any court said. That last part matters. Because just 5 days earlier, the U.S. Supreme Court had handed Trump a significant legal defeat. In a 6-3 ruling, the court concluded that Trump's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the legal mechanism he'd used to slap sweeping Liberation Day tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, was unconstitutional. Illegal. Done. Within hours, Trump signed a new executive order, a 10% global tariff under a completely different law. He was back in the game before the ink on the ruling was dry. Then, right after the State of the Union, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer walked out to speak with journalists at the Capitol and said something that changed the entire frame of these negotiations. He told CBC News that when the United States makes deals with other countries, those countries accept that America can maintain a tariff on them. That's the new baseline. That's the new normal. If Canada wants to agree that we can have some level of higher tariff on them while they open up their markets to us on things like dairy, Greer said, then that's a helpful conversation. He also called out Canada for not removing retaliatory measures, not putting American wine and spirits back on shelves, not reopening procurement contracts, not dropping what he called unfair practices. And when someone asked Prime Minister Mark Carney the next morning about Trump's State of the Union, about all of it, Carney said he hadn't watched it. I'm not sure that was accidental. Is this the response you expected? I want to know what you make of it. Drop your read in the comments. Here's where the picture shifts, because what looks like Carney being dismissive is actually part of a calculated posture that Canada has been building for months, and you need the full timeline to understand it. This trade war didn't start with last Tuesday's speech. It started in February 2025, when Trump announced 25% tariffs on most Canadian imports. Canada fired back with retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion worth of U.S. goods, which escalated to $155 billion over the following weeks. Back and forth. Escalation after escalation. Then something shifted. In August 2025, Trump raised tariffs on Canadian goods to 35% from 25%. In October, he canceled all trade talks entirely, because the province of Ontario ran a TV ad using Ronald Reagan's own words to argue against tariffs. Reagan, the Republican patron saint, and Trump tanked the negotiations over it. By the time Carney stood up at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January 2026 and told the assembled leaders of the world that middle powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu, that was a declaration. He didn't name the United States. He didn't have to. Trump, sitting at the same conference, heard it and felt it. Within days, Trump had revoked his invitation to Carney to join his Board of Peace and posted on Truth Social that Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark. Carney's response to that? Canada doesn't live because of the United States. Canada thrives because we are Canadian. These two men are not getting along, and that matters for everything that comes next. Here's what I think most people are underestimating. Pull back from the daily back and forth, and you start to see this is really about something much larger than tariff percentages or dairy access. The U.S. Trade Representative just openly declared that the foundational architecture of North American trade, the tariff-free framework that has existed since NAFTA in 1994, that Trump himself signed as CUSMA in 2018, that he called a great deal, is now the thing he wants to fundamentally rewrite. Not adjust, rewrite. Greer was direct about it. He said CUSMA didn't do enough to bring manufacturing back to American soil, that the reshoring didn't happen fast enough, that there's too much screwdriver operation happening, where goods made in China or Vietnam get minor processing in Canada and then flow into the U.S. duty-free. In other words, the United States is telling Canada, we built a system together, we don't like the results, and you're going to pay for it now. And here's the part that nobody's really connecting. The CUSMA agreement has a mandatory review deadline. Every country must signal by July 1st of this year whether they want to extend it, renegotiate it, or let it expire. That review is now the most consequential trade moment Canada has faced in a generation. And it's 5 months away. Does this change how you're reading this situation? Because I'm not sure I was seeing the full picture until I mapped the timeline. Let me know what's landing for you below. Now layer this on top. Carney is not sitting still. While Trump and Greer have been making noise, Carney has been assembling what looks like a war cabinet for the negotiation ahead. He appointed Janice Charette, former clerk of the Privy Council, the most senior position in the Canadian public service, someone who served under both Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau, as Canada's chief trade negotiator. He also brought in Mark Wiseman, a global investment banker and pension fund manager, as the new Canadian ambassador to Washington. This is not a group you assemble if you're planning to roll over. At the same time, Canada has been systematically building leverage elsewhere. Carney flew to Beijing and signed what his government called a new strategic partnership with China, lowering tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for China easing duties on Canadian canola, lobster, and other agricultural products. That move infuriated Trump, who threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if the China deal went forward. Then Canada pointed out, accurately, that it wasn't a free trade agreement, that Trump had literally praised the deal when it was signed, that the U.S. had signed its own deal with China months earlier. And Carney is leading a broader coalition-building effort. According to recent reports, Canada is now heading up discussions between the European Union and the Indo-Pacific Trading Bloc, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, to build a new global trading architecture that doesn't center on the United States. At Davos, Carney explicitly said this isn't a transition, it's a rupture, his word. Meanwhile, something remarkable happened in Washington. The U.S. House of Representatives voted to repeal Trump's tariffs on Canada. The tally was 219 to 211. Bipartisan. Republicans crossing the aisle to side with Democrats against their own president's signature policy. It's symbolic. It won't pass the Senate and Trump would veto it anyway. But it's the clearest sign yet that even inside the American system, there is real discomfort with what's being done to this relationship. Ontario Premier Doug Ford put it simply, a tariff on Canada is a tax on Americans. They know it. They're feeling the crunch down there. Canada's Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne echoed it almost word for word. This is a messaging strategy. They're not just defending Canada. They're trying to make the argument inside the United States that this hurts Americans too. And based on the House vote, it's working on at least some members of Congress. So where does this actually land? Here's what the next 6 months look like. Formal CUSMA negotiations are expected to begin within weeks. Greer and Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc are expected to meet in Washington soon. Canada's position going in is that it already has the best trade deal with the United States of any country in the world. The CUSMA exemption is still shielding roughly 90% of Canadian exports from tariffs. That's leverage. That's something Canada would be giving up if CUSMA collapses. Greer's position going in is that tariffs are now a permanent feature of American trade policy, not a negotiating chip. That Canada needs to open dairy markets, that America needs to see more industrial production reshored, and that the rules governing what counts as made in North America need to be tightened significantly to prevent Chinese and Vietnamese goods from using Canada as a backdoor. These positions are not easily reconciled, and there's a wild card that changes the entire calculation. The U.S. midterm elections are in November. Greer has reportedly told people privately that he's preparing for negotiations with both Canada and Mexico to run past the midterms. That's a long game. That's pressure sustained through an American political cycle in which inflation, consumer prices, and economic anxiety will be front-page issues every week. The average American is already feeling the impact of tariffs through higher food and energy prices. Canada supplies roughly 60% of U.S. crude oil imports, 85% of U.S. electricity imports, and is the largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium to the United States. These are not replaceable at scale, not quickly, possibly not at all, which is exactly why Carney didn't panic when Trump threatened 100% tariffs, why he didn't scramble when Greer said permanent tariffs are the new baseline, why he said he hadn't watched the State of the Union. Because the leverage is real. The dependence runs in both directions, and Carney is betting that time and economic gravity are on Canada's side, at least long enough for the American political system to start pushing back on its own president. Whether that bet pays off is the question nobody can answer yet. Strip everything else away, and here's what this moment really is. Two countries that built one of the most integrated trading relationships in modern history are now being asked to renegotiate the terms of that relationship from scratch, under political pressure, on a timeline, while the leader of one side is also threatening to annex the other as the 51st state. Carney called it clearly. The 80-year period of American economic leadership, of open trade, of alliances rooted in trust, in his words, it's over. Not fading, over. Whether that's accurate, or whether it's a negotiating position, or whether it's wishful thinking from someone trying to build a new world before the old one is fully gone, I genuinely don't know. And I'm suspicious of anyone who says they do. What I do know is that by July 1st, 3 countries will have to tell the world whether this trade agreement still exists. And whatever they decide will reshape the economic reality of millions of people who had no vote in any of it. So here's what I'm genuinely curious about. If you were Carney walking into that negotiation room, knowing what Greer just said, knowing what Trump has threatened, knowing what Canada has built with China and Europe, what's your opening move? Where do you give? Where do you hold the line? Tell me your read. Because this is the kind of decision that looks obvious in hindsight and impossible in the moment. And we're still in the moment.